Have you ever wondered where Cain's wife came from? This simple question has already taken the sleep of many people. After all, if Adam and Eve were the first human beings, and Cain was the first child, so who Cain married? This question is much deeper than it seems, and many avoid talking about it because it involves delicate themes such as incest in the Bible, marriages between siblings, and even the very origin of humanity according to the scriptures. For years, the answer has been hidden behind superficial interpretations or even silence for fear of controversy. But today, you will find out the hidden truth about Cain's wife based on the biblical text, logic, and the progressive revelation of God. And look, what we will reveal here will challenge what you have learned at Sunday school. This is an invitation to look at Genesis in a new, deeper, and more detail that many people ignore. Get ready, what comes next will make you see the Bible with other eyes and understand how everything fits when we put each piece in your place. In this video, we will explore the hidden truth about Cain's wife and how the Bible addresses controversial and surprising topics such as incest, divine laws, and the evolution of human morality. Get ready for a journey of discoveries that will change the way you see the history of humanity. Stay with me until the end, and if you don't want to lose any details, subscribe to the channel and enable notifications. You will be surprised by what we will reveal. It all starts in the Garden of Eden, where God shapes Adam from the dust of the earth and blows in his nostrils the breath of life. This is the first time that humanity appears in the biblical narrative not as a multitude, but as a single man, created in the image and likeness of the Creator. Shortly thereafter comes Eva, made from the rib of Adam, to be his mate. Together, they represent the beginning of a human race, according to the Bible, a couple chosen to start the story of us all. But it doesn't stop there. God not only created them, he also gave a direct order fruit and multiply. This commandment has deep implications, for it shows that from the beginning, the divine will was the growth of humanity through the union between Adam and Eve. They were not made to live alone in Eden, but to generate children and daughters that would populate the earth. And that's where many start to ask themselves, if there were only Adam and Eve, how did so many people come up later? It looks confusing, right? But God's plan was clear from the beginning. Multiplication would come from their union and Adam's offspring. And this growth would not be immediate, but gradual, generation after generation, forming families that would later fill the known world. This divine and singular origin of humanity eliminates the idea of multiple human strains parallel. There was no second mysterious race or hidden civilizations. According to Genesis, it all started with this couple, and the rest of the story with Cain and Abel, 7, and so many others is the unfolding of this lineage, a seemingly simple but full of impactful revelations. And it is about them that we will continue to talk about. The Bible is categorical when it states that all humanity came from one blood. In Acts 17:26, the Apostle Paul declares that God of one made the whole human race to dwell upon the face of the earth. This stresses that there is no parallel lineage or another group of humans outside Adam and Eve's offspring. It is natural that questions arise. But there were no other humans out there? The biblical answer is clear no. The origin of humanity occurs exclusively from Adam and Eve. Genesis 4 and 5 make this evident in detailing the genealogy of their children, even citing that they had children and daughters, not just Cain, Abel, and 7. This information is essential to understand the family structure of the early days. This concept is uncomfortable for some because it bumps into themes such as marriages between siblings and incest at the beginning of history. But one must understand the context. If all humanity began with a single couple, there was no other possibility unless the children of Adam and Eve marry each other. At first, this was not seen as sin, as we will explore later. It was simply necessary to fulfill God's plan to multiply the human race. This point is crucial. By accepting that everyone came from Adam and Eve, we also understand why certain events like Cain's marriage make sense within the biblical narrative. What seems strange today was part of a totally different reality in the beginning. And speaking of Cain, it's time to dive into one of the greatest biblical curiosities of all time. Who was Cain's wife? This is one of the most common and controversial questions that arise when reading Genesis. Whom Cain married? If Adam and Eve were the first human beings, and only talk about Cain, Abel, and then 7. Where did Cain's wife come from? The answer is precisely in the verses that many ignore. Genesis 5:4 says Adam had children and daughters. That is, Cain's wife was her sister, or at least a niece, a very close relative. Yes, it may seem strange to our modern eyes, but at that time, brothers were married for a simple reason. It was the only way to continue humanity. There was no other human group hidden in some part of the planet. The Bible gives no room for this idea. Everything points out that the first marriages happened within the family of Adam and Eve. And, strange as it sounds, this was part of God's plan in that context. Also, it is important to remember that the children of Adam and Eve were not just three. They lived many years, Adam, until 930. At this time, it is reasonable to imagine that they have had dozens or even hundreds of children and daughters. This means that Cain, when leaving the presence of the Lord after committing the murder, did not wander in an empty world. There were people already trained from the same lineage, and among them, he took a wife and had a son named Enoch. This union of Cain with a direct relative was not sin at that time. This would only be considered wrong much later. At first, it was a matter of survival of the species. So when someone asks you who was Cain's wife, now you know how to answer with biblical and logical basis. What's more, this answer makes room for another essential debate: incest at the beginning of history. Let's talk about it. The word incest carries a huge weight these days, and rightly so. But in the context of Genesis, incest at the beginning of history was a necessity, not a transgression. When the early children of Adam and Eve were born, there was no union option than brothers or relatives very close. At that moment, incest was not sin, for there was no divine law yet to prohibit him. An essential point to understand this is a genetic issue. The DNA of Adam and Eve was perfect, without the mutations and weaknesses we accumulate throughout the generations. This means that the risks of genetic diseases associated with incest, which today are very high, simply did not exist at that time. The Bible itself and genetics go together at this point, showing that God's plan functioned based on the integrity of the original genetic material. Over time, human genetic burden began to deteriorate as a consequence of sin and natural degeneration. But at first, marriages between siblings did not cause physical or moral damage. They were seen as normal, even necessary, so that the human race would grow and fulfill the divine order of fruiting and multiplying. Therefore, the children of Adam and Eve joined each other without guilt. It was a path outlined by the Creator himself. So no, Cain did nothing wrong when marrying a sister. He was following the natural course of things at that time. The question of incest as sin would only come later, when God establishes specific laws to protect humanity. And that's where history begins to divide between two strange Cain's offspring in the line of 7, each with very different characteristics, and that's what we'll talk about now. After killing Abel, Cain was marked by God and left for the land of Nod. There he built a city and gave the place the name of his son Enoch. This attitude shows that, even removed from the presence of the Lord, Cain followed with his life, constituted family, and founded the first registered city in the Bible. From it came a lineage of people who increasingly distanced themselves from God. One of Cain's most notorious descendants was Lamech, and he is quoted prominently for 2 reasons. He was the first man in the Bible to practice polygamy and also committed murder. He had 2 wives and killed a man, boasting it with hard words. This behavior shows that, over generations, Cain's offspring was morally and spiritually corrupt, a reflection of Cain's sin deepening. It is curious to note that although civilization develops through this lineage with advances in areas such as creation of musical instruments and metallurgy, there is no record of worship or fear of God among them. This contrasts strongly with the line of 7, which we will see next. The Bible seems to draw a parallel between human progress and spiritual decay in this specific lineage. This distinction between the descendants of Cain and those of the line of 7 helps us understand the beginning of the division between those who invoke the name of the Lord and those who follow their own ways. And it is precisely in 7 that the hope of humanity falls after the tragedy involving Abel. Let us now dive into the history of the righteous, those who kept alive the flame of faith from beginning. Abel, despite being tragically murdered by his brother Cain, is remembered as a righteous man. He was the first martyr in history, offering God a pleasant sacrifice. His death though tragic, had a profound impact on biblical history. For God made 7 to be given to Adam and Eve as a substitute for Abel. With this, God did not leave the earth without a lineage of righteous to follow his will. 7, unlike Cain, sought to live according to divine principles. He had children who, in turn, taught the next generation to worship God. The line of 7 became the lineage of hope, through which humanity would continue to have a witness of faith amid the growing sin that took over the earth. This lineage was also marked by the practice of worship of God, and its generations are mentioned more often than those of Cain. From 7 came Noah, the man chosen by God to save humanity from a flood. Noah himself, being a descendant of 7, was an example of faith and obedience in a corrupted world. Thus, all the post-Diluvian humanity, except for the descendant of Cain, came from this lineage. This biblical detail is fundamental to understanding how God, even in the midst of chaos and corruption, maintained a faithful remnant, the line of the righteous, which would serve as a basis for the renewal of the earth. Therefore, Abel and 7 were not only figures of the past, but symbols of the pattern that God established so that, through a faithful lineage, he would preserve his plan of salvation to humanity. This brings us an important reflection: God always has a remnant, even in the moments of greater apostasy. The question is, are you part of this remnant? Over the passing of generations, humanity moved away from original perfection and, consequently, sin became more evident. The incest, which was no longer seen at the beginning, became a no longer acceptable practice as the world is corrupted. The deterioration of human genetics and the increase of sin caused God to establish clear laws later what should be avoided. These laws, recorded in Leviticus 18, include the prohibition of incest. What has changed from Adam and Eve to the time of Moses? The main difference was genetic and moral degeneration. As humanity moved away from God, the consequences of sin intensified, including genetic defects that made the incest dangerous. When God forbade incest in Leviticus 18, motivation was not only moral, but also to protect the people from disease and genetic complications, which were already beginning to emerge due to continuous exposure to sin. Before this revelation, as we have seen, incest was not sin because the perfect state of Adam's DNA, and Eve caused no problems. But as humanity spread and descent multiplied, God introduced these laws to protect the physical and spiritual integrity of his people. Therefore, the prohibition was not only a matter of morality, but also a divine protection for the health of the human population. The important thing here is to understand that as God revealed more of his will, the rules and divine laws adapted to the new reality of the world. God did not impose these laws immediately, but did it when humanity was already at a stage where moral and physical degeneration made these practices dangerous. In other words, God's progressive revelation aims to take care of humanity as it evolves in its journey of faith and morality. When we look at the history of weddings in the Bible, we see that in the first generations, a union among close relatives was not only common, but necessary. Abraham married his sister Sarah, Isaac married his cousin Rebekah, and Jacob had wives that were his cousins. These relatives' marriages were not only allowed, but they were essential to maintain the continuity of the lineage and the purity of Israel's founding families. In this context, marriages between relatives in the Bible were aligned with God's plans to form a separate and holy nation. What draws attention here is that, before the law of Moses, the practice of marrying close relatives was not considered wrong. As we have seen in the case of Adam and Eve, the need to perpetuate humanity and maintaining lineages was a primordial issue, and the union between brothers and close relatives was a way of fulfilling this task. There were no prohibitions that would later appear in Scripture when God began to reveal clearer rules for the lives of his people. However, after Moses' law, marriages between close relatives were prohibited. This was established in Leviticus 18, where God details the limits of family relationships that would be unacceptable. The change of perspective from allowed to forbidden occurred because, as we have already discussed, the genetic condition of humanity was no longer the same. Moral and physical degeneration has caused God to intervene to preserve the health of his creation. However, despite these prohibitions, marriages between close relatives continue to happen in some parts of the Bible, as in the case of Amnon and Tamar, Lot and his daughters, or even Judah and Tamar. These cases, however, are always marked by tragic consequences, showing that when the practice of God's law is ignored, the results are not positive. The lesson here is clear. While in primordial times, marriages between relatives were a necessity, later they became a symbol of disobedience and sin. When we talk about incest these days, one of the biggest points of concern is the genetic effects that this practice can cause. God, by forbidding incest later in the Bible, was worrying about the physical and spiritual health of his people, and a large part of this concern was related to the impact that incest would have on the genetics of future generations. What before had no significant risks due to Adam's genetic purity, and Eve became a real danger as sin and corruption spread. The concept of genetic distortion is much more understood today. With the advances of genetics and biology, genetic diseases such as hereditary disorders, birth defects, and other genetic-related problems may arise when close relatives marry, as they share a similar genetic pool. Over time, these mutations accumulate, making the health of the population more fragile. This is one of the reasons why incest is sin in the laws of God. He wanted to protect the physical integrity of humanity. God, with his infinite wisdom, already knew that union between brothers or close relatives could result in serious health problems and even compromise the fertility of future generations. Although in the beginning, with the pure genetics of Adam and Eve, this was not a concern, the cumulative effect of sin and human choices led to the need for a divine decree. Forbidding incest was a way for God to protect the life and well-being of his people. Therefore, the reason God has banned incest is not only a moral matter, but also a matter of health and preservation of humanity. It not only establishes rules for our behavior, but also for our survival and physical well-being, showing their goodness and zeal for creation. These laws did not arise as a punishment, but as a measure of divine protection, so that future generations could live in health and fulfill God's purposes. God's progressive revelation is an essential concept to understand how God deals with humanity throughout history. From the moment Adam and Eve were created to the complete revelation of his will in Scripture, God was manifesting himself gradually, adapting his instructions to the capacity and necessity of the people. At first, God's guidelines were simple, but as humanity grew and corruption spread, he was bringing more specific revelations to deal with the complex situations of human life. Regarding incest, God's progressive revelation was evident when, after the fall, he allowed humanity to multiply without restrictions on marriages between close relatives. This transition period lasted until sin and its consequences began to affect the physical and moral health of the population more deeply. When God instituted laws in Leviticus, he was not only establishing rules of morality, but also taking care of physical health issues that began to emerge as human genetics became increasingly failure due to sin. It is fascinating to realize that, as humanity evolved, God also revealed more of his character and its plans. In the beginning, revelation was broader and more general, but over time, especially after the flood, God has revealed more specific and detailed principles to guide his people. These instructions did not emerge at once, but were gradually given as man was prepared to understand and apply them correctly in his life. This teaches us that in our spiritual walk, we are also subject to progressive revelation. God reveals himself to us according to our spiritual maturity, our experiences, and our desire to know more deeply. Thus, we can understand that God's progressive revelation does not apply only to the Old Testament laws, but also the way he works in our lives, guiding us step by step for its final purpose. When we look at the story of Adam and Eve, we see how, at the beginning, incest was a necessary practice for the perpetuation of humanity. Marriages between brothers were essential to ensure the continuity of the human race. But as sin spread and genetic degeneration intensified, God, in his wisdom and love, introduced rules to protect humanity from humanity, including the prohibition of incest. Over time, the laws of God became more detailed and specific, reflecting the moral and spiritual growth of the people. God's progressive revelation shows how he adapts its guidelines to meet the needs of each generation. Throughout the Bible, we have learned that the first practices, which may seem unusual to us today, had a divine purpose. And as an effect of the earth, God revealed more appropriate ways to live in harmony with his will. In the end, the history of incest in the Bible teaches us not only about the physical aspects of humanity, but also about God's care with his people. He establishes norms not only to preserve morality, but also protect the physical and spiritual health of his children. Understanding these changes over time helps us recognize how much God in his infinite wisdom has always had a plan to protect and guide us in the midst of difficulties. What we learn here is that God always acts with purpose. At first, the union between brothers was necessary, but over time he instituted laws to ensure the welfare of humanity. And the great lesson is that, even in our own lives, he continues to guide us and reveal his will progressively as we grow in faith and understanding. So, let's reflect, are we aware of the changes that God is revealing us in our daily walk? Now that you understand the divine purpose behind these changes, I ask, are you aware of God's progressive revelations in your life? Follow your guide to preserve what is good and fair. If this content has aroused your curiosity and you want more insights like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications to continue exploring the Bible in a way that will transform your understanding of Scripture.